It was the kind of house that did not look like a prison. Trent Park sat on 413 acres of parkland in Middlesex, north of London, with a Georgian manor at its center, formal gardens, tennis courts, a golf course, and rooms furnished with antiques requisitioned from country estates across England. German generals captured in North Africa and Italy, and later in France, arrived here and were shown to their quarters and given orderlies, and told they were prisoners of war. They were not told about the microphones. The microphones were everywhere, hidden in the walls of the drawing rooms, in the ceilings of the dining rooms, in the gardens where the generals walked in the afternoons and believed themselves alone. Every conversation was recorded. Every whispered confidence between two men who thought they were speaking privately was transcribed by teams of German-speaking British intelligence officers working around the clock in a basement room 2 floors below where the generals slept. The operation ran from 1942 to 1945. By the time it ended, British intelligence had accumulated tens of thousands of pages of transcripts. They were classified immediately. They remained classified for more than 50 years. When historians finally gained access to them in the early 2000s, largely through the work of German historian Sönke Neitzel and his colleague Harald Welzer, what they found inside was not what anyone had expected. It was not a record of resistance. It was not a record of men who had secretly opposed Hitler and were waiting for the right moment to say so. It was a record of something far more difficult to process. A record of professional soldiers talking to each other with complete candor about a war they were fighting, and in doing so revealing, without any awareness that they were doing it, exactly what kind of men they were and what kind of war they had actually fought. The British operation had a simple logic behind it. Prisoners of war, when placed in comfortable surroundings with other prisoners of the same rank and nationality, talk. They talk about the war, about their commanders, about specific operations, about things they would never say in an interrogation room with a British officer across the table. The discomfort of formal interrogation produces silence or performance. The comfort of a country house with good food and other Germans produces something else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Scotland, who oversaw the interrogation program, wrote in a classified memorandum in 1943 that the most valuable intelligence was never extracted through direct questioning. It was captured in the unguarded moments between questions, in the conversations that prisoners believed were private, in the things men said to each other at 2 a.m, when the brandy was finished and they had stopped being careful. Scotland had learned this on the Western Front in the First World War. He had spent 25 years refining the principle. Trent Park was its fullest expression. The first generals arrived in 1942, captured in North Africa as Rommel's Afrika Korps collapsed under Allied pressure. They were men of significant rank and long service, general lieutenants and generals who had commanded divisions and corps across multiple theaters. They arrived expecting the treatment that their rank entitled them to under the Geneva Convention, and they received it and more. What they did not receive was privacy. Within days of their arrival, the transcripts were already producing intelligence that British commanders found invaluable. Not primarily tactical intelligence, though there was some of that. Something more fundamental. A picture of how the German officer class thought, what it valued, what it feared, and what it was willing to say about the war it was fighting when it believed no one outside the room could hear. What emerged from the transcripts over 3 years of recordings was a portrait that contradicted almost everything that German generals would later claim in their post-war memoirs. The memoirs, written in the late 1940s and 1950s, told a consistent story. The generals had been professional soldiers following orders. They had known nothing about the crimes being committed in the East. They had privately disagreed with Hitler's strategic decisions. They had fought an honorable war under difficult circumstances. The Trent Park transcripts told a different story, in the general's own words, recorded before anyone knew the war would end, before anyone had reason to construct a defense, before the concept of an alibi had become necessary. A transcript from November 1942, 3 months after the first generals arrived, records a conversation between two captured corps commanders over dinner. One of them had commanded forces on the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa. The other had served exclusively in the Western Theater. The Eastern Front commander described, in the unhurried manner of a man recounting professional experience, the methods used to pacify occupied Soviet territory behind the lines. He was not describing something he had opposed. He was describing it the way a civil engineer might describe a drainage problem that had been successfully resolved. The British transcriber noted in the margin that the account was being given without any apparent discomfort. The second general, the one who had not served in the East, asked a single clarifying question about logistics. He did not express surprise. He did not express disapproval. The conversation moved on to the quality of the wine. This exchange, 11 minutes of recorded conversation at a dinner table in a country house in Middlesex, was classified and filed. It sat in an archive for 53 years.
The transcripts of conversations about Hitler followed a pattern that British intelligence analysts found immediately significant. In formal interrogations, generals were careful. They expressed varying degrees of professional respect for Hitler as a political leader, while maintaining that his military decisions had been flawed. This was the performance that rank and training produced under direct questioning. In the private conversations captured by the microphones, the picture was more complicated and in some ways more revealing. The generals did not secretly hate Hitler. Many of them had admired him, had believed in the project he represented, had felt themselves to be participants in something historically significant. What had changed for some of them by the time they arrived at Trent Park was not ideology, but outcome. They had begun to believe Germany would lose, and they blamed Hitler not for starting the war or for how it was being fought, but for the specific operational decisions that had put them in a British country house rather than at a victory parade in Moscow. The distinction mattered enormously to the British analysts reading the transcripts. It meant that the resistance narrative, the idea of a German officer class secretly opposed to National Socialism and waiting for the chance to act, was largely fiction. What existed instead was a professional class that had collaborated fully, believed sincerely, and was now processing the cognitive difficulty of a belief system that was producing catastrophic results. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured at El Alamein in November 1942, and one of the most senior officers to pass through Trent Park, was recorded in December of that year in a conversation with another general that British intelligence considered one of the most significant transcripts of the entire operation. Von Thoma had dined with Montgomery the night of his capture, a fact that was widely reported, and that von Thoma used in his postwar memoir to suggest a certain professional distance from.
The conversations about the war's progress revealed a pattern of self-deception that British intelligence analysts documented carefully across hundreds of transcripts. German generals, confronted with evidence of German defeats, consistently attributed those defeats to factors outside their control. Hitler's interference in operational decisions, the unreliability of Italian allies, the weather on the Eastern Front, the failure of the Luftwaffe to provide adequate air support, supply shortages produced by Allied interdiction. What almost never appeared in the private conversations, any more than in the formal interrogations, was a systematic assessment of whether Germany had the strategic resources to fight the war it had started. The generals had been trained in operational thinking, in the management of forces at the corps and army level. They had not been trained to think about industrial capacity, about the relationship between factory output and battlefield endurance, about the mathematics of a two-front war against opponents whose combined production dwarfed anything Germany could sustain. When these subjects came up in the transcripts, they came up as grievances rather than analyses. The Americans had too many tanks. The Soviets had too many men. The British had too many ships. The tone was that of men who had been cheated.
A conversation recorded in the summer of 1944, after the Allied landings in Normandy had made the war's outcome increasingly clear, captures a group of 4 generals in the drawing room of Trent Park on a warm evening. New prisoners had arrived from France, men captured in the weeks after D-Day, and they were telling the longer-term residents of the house what they had seen. The account they gave was specific and detailed. German panzer divisions unable to move by day because Allied aircraft controlled the sky above every road in France. Supply convoys destroyed before they could reach the front. Infantry units fighting without artillery support because the ammunition had been burned in trucks that never arrived. One of the newer arrivals, a general who had commanded a division in Normandy, described watching from a concealed position as a single American fighter bomber destroyed 11 vehicles in a column on a road below him in less than 8 minutes. He had counted the burning vehicles afterward. He said this in the tone of a man still processing something he could not entirely believe had happened. The longer-term residents of Trent Park listened to this account and said very little. They had been hearing versions of it for 2 years. They had heard the progression from North Africa to Italy to France, the same story in different geography, the same gap between what German military doctrine had prepared them for and what industrial-scale Allied warfare actually looked like. One of them, a general who had been at Trent Park for nearly 18 months, said quietly that he had known since 1943 that the war was over. He said this without drama, as a simple statement of professional assessment. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone asked about dinner.
The question that the Trent Park transcripts posed most directly, and that the British analysts who read them wrestled with most carefully, was the question of what the German generals actually knew about what was being done in their names and under their command in the occupied territories of the East. The post-war narrative, repeated consistently in the memoirs and in the testimony of surviving generals at Nuremberg and in subsequent trials, was one of professional compartmentalization. Fighting generals fought. Administrative questions about occupied populations were handled by other agencies, by the SS, by the Gestapo, by civil administrators appointed from Berlin. The generals commanded their divisions and their corps and were not responsible for, and in many cases not aware of, what happened behind their lines. The Trent Park transcripts did not entirely support this account. They did not support it at all. Conversations recorded across 3 years of surveillance show generals discussing specific incidents and specific policies in the occupied East with a familiarity that was incompatible with the ignorance they would later claim. They discussed these things not in the urgent, hushed tones of men sharing dangerous secrets, but in the matter-of-fact cadences of men discussing professional matters that everyone in the room already understood. The knowledge was not hidden, it was ambient. It was the background against which the professional conversations about tactics and logistics and the quality of Allied equipment were conducted.
The transcripts were not used at Nuremberg. This was a decision that reflected the legal and political complexities of using secretly recorded evidence in a formal judicial proceeding, and also a decision that reflected British intelligence's reluctance to reveal the methods and extent of the Trent Park operation, which might still have active applications. The generals who passed through Trent Park and survived the war wrote their memoirs and gave their interviews and constructed the accounts of honorable professional service that shaped how the German officer class was understood for decades. Some of them built successful post-war careers, consulted by the new West German military, interviewed by historians, treated as sources of professional wisdom about modern warfare. The transcripts sat in the archive. Sonke Neitzel found them in the early 2000s while researching an unrelated subject. He spent years working through them, and what he found required him to substantially revise the book he had planned to write. He published the results in 2011 in a work that drew on the Trent Park transcripts alongside similar recordings made at American facilities, where German prisoners had also been housed in comfortable surroundings with hidden microphones in the walls. The American transcripts from a facility in Virginia called Fort Hunt told the same story.
The house at Trent Park still stands. It is a university campus now, and the rooms where German generals slept and talked and believed themselves unobserved are lecture halls and administrative offices. The gardens where they walked in the afternoons, constructing their careful accounts of a war that was killing millions of people across a continent, are maintained by groundskeepers who know nothing of what was said there. The transcripts are in the National Archives at Kew, accessible to researchers. 400,000 words of men speaking without masks.
They said things in that house that they spent the rest of their lives denying they had ever thought. They said them to each other in the drawing room, in the garden, and over dinner, in the unhurried way of men among their own kind. And the machines in the walls recorded every word. And the young men and women in the basement transcribed them, and the paper went into folders, and the